The wind on the Kansas plain arrived each morning before daylight, moving without interruption across 400 miles of open grassland before it encountered anything tall enough to slow it. There were no trees here, not one within sight in most directions, and that single fact organized nearly every decision a plain settler made in the first years of a homestead claim. What could be built? What could be burned for warmth? How the earth itself were to stand in for every material the eastern forest had once supplied. The sky above this country sat wide and flat and low, described by nearly every first-time observer as something that pressed downward rather than lifted, too present, too uninterrupted by any vertical form. In the early morning of late autumn, before the November light had fully arrived and before the temperature had lifted above freezing, the grassland had the quality of a gray lake, moving and long. Even swells and the wind ran through it, and quiet only in the sense that no human sound competed with the steady, toneless rushing of the air. Between the passage of the Homestead Act in 1862 and the final decades of the 19th century, more than 600,000 families filed claims on public land across the Great Plains and the Western Territories, drawn westward by a combination of federal policy, economic necessity, and promotional literature that described a region in terms its climate and soil could not consistently support. This channel posts new narrations each week, and the approach here is always the same: careful, unhurried, and grounded as closely in the historical record as the evidence allows. What those families discovered on arrival was not a landscape of mild and welcoming abundance. It was a place of radical, sustained exposure, one that demanded total commitment in return for deeply uncertain reward, and that extracted its costs not in money or acreage, but in years of physical life, and in many cases, in lives themselves. The law that made all of this possible was passed by the United States Congress on the 20th of May, 1862, and signed into effect that same day by President Abraham Lincoln, who had spent much of his political career arguing that the capacity of an ordinary man to own and work his own land was a foundation on which a healthy democratic republic rested. The law was called the Homestead Act, and its central provision was plainly stated: any citizen or intended citizen of the United States, 21 years of age or older, who had never borne arms against the federal government, could file a claim at a general land office on 160 acres of surveyed public land, pay a registration fee of $10, and receive full legal title to those acres after 5 years of continuous residence and demonstrable improvement. 160 acres was a quarter section, a square of ground roughly half a mile on each side, and in the political language of the period it sounded like a genuinely democratic offering. Enough for a farm, enough for a family's permanent independence, enough to establish a household that might persist through generations. What the act did not specify, and what its congressional champions generally preferred not to examine closely, was what would actually cost a family to reach that land, to establish themselves on it, and to keep themselves alive for the 5 consecutive years the law required before the government would transfer legal ownership to their names. The stated cost of a homestead claim was $10. The realistic cost was considerably and predictably higher. A family departing from a city like Cincinnati or Chicago or St. Louis in the early 1870s, intending to file a claim in western Kansas or the southern Dakota Territory, faced a cascade of unavoidable expenses before a single acre was officially theirs. A covered wagon adequate to carry a family of 4 or 5 and their household goods through a journey of 6 to 12 weeks cost between $100 and $200 from an established outfitter in a Missouri River town like St. Joseph or Independence. A team of oxen, 2 animals being the practical minimum necessary to haul a loaded wagon across the uneven ground west of the Missouri, ran between $80 and $160, depending on the condition of the animals and the availability of sellers. A steel-bladed breaking plow designed to cut through the dense root mat of native buffalo grass and bluestem, which resisted lighter implements entirely, cost between $12 and $25. Seed grain for a first season planting of wheat or corn across 60 to 80 acres required another $60 to $90. Food supplies sufficient to sustain the family through both the journey and the first several months of residence before any harvest could be taken: flour, salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, coffee, and molasses, added $50 to $100 more. When these costs were assembled, accounting also for river crossing fees, road tolls, veterinary expenses, and the replacement of equipment broken or lost along the way, The realistic outlay for a single family attempting a homestead claim in the peak years of the program fell somewhere between $500 and $1,200. This in a period when a skilled industrial labor in an eastern city might earn between $400 and $500 in a full year continuous employment. Rail travel had become available for portions of the journey by the late 1860s, following completion of the first transcontinental connection in 1869, and the subsequent construction of branch lines reaching into Kansas and Nebraska. A family traveling by rail from Chicago to Topeka or from St. Paul to the Dakota Territory terminus could complete a journey that had once required 2 months of wagon travel in a matter of days. But a rail passage for a family of 5, including the freight cost of shipping their livestock and equipment in separate cars, ran between $100 and $200. An additional burden that families who had already stretched their available capital to its practical limits often could not absorb. Those who could not afford the rail fare continued to travel overland in their wagons, following the established emigrant roads running along the Platte River corridor through Nebraska or through the Kansas River Valley to the south, living in those wagons for the full duration of the journey and arriving at their destination with their animals already worn by weeks of road travel and their equipment subjected to the accumulated stresses of rough terrain, river crossings, and whatever weather the season produced. The journey did not kill travelers in the numbers the cholera years of the early 1850s had taken from earlier emigrant parties, but reliably diminished the physical and financial reserves of nearly everyone who made it, so that those who arrived at a land office to file their papers were already at some remove from what they had been at the moment of departure. This accumulation of costs carried an implication that the promotional literature of the period consistently and sometimes deliberately obscured. The families who successfully completed the journey and filed legitimate claims were not, taken as a group, the landless poor. They were families who had managed to accumulate a minimum of usable capital through years of careful saving, through pooled resources within immigrant community networks or extended family arrangements, or in the case of veterans, through the application of federal land warrants that could be used in partial place of a cash filing fee. The genuinely destitute, the families in the tenement districts of New York and Philadelphia and Boston, the industrial laborers in the mill towns of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the people about whom Homestead Act advocates had spoken most insistently during the bill's long legislative history, were in most cases unable to mount the financial expedition the law theoretically offered them. The economist Richard Theodore Ely, reviewing the program's outcomes from the perspective of the early 1890s, concluded that the Homestead Act had functioned not as a bounty for the landless poor, but as a mechanism that rewarded those who already possessed sufficient capital to make the initial journey and investment, a judgment that the demographic record of actual claimants supports with considerable consistency. Among those who did possess the means to attempt the journey, immigrant communities from Northern and Central Europe formed a significant and geographically coherent proportion of the settlement population. Families from the German states of Baden, Württemberg, Hanover, and Hesse arrived in American eastern ports and made their way inland by rail and wagon, many of them having been recruited in their home villages by agents employed by American railroad companies, who traveled through Germany, Scandinavia, and Britain distributing promotional literature in translated form. A particularly consequential immigrant group was a community known as the Volga Germans or German Russians, ethnic Germans whose ancestors had accepted an invitation from Empress Catherine II to settle in the Volga River region of Russia in the 1760s, and who emigrated to Kansas and Dakotas in significant numbers beginning in 1874, bringing with them a variety of winter wheat called turkey red that had been adapted through generations of cultivation to a climate of cold, dry winters and hot, dry summers remarkably similar to that of the Central American plains. Turkey red wheat would, in the following decades, become the dominant grain crop of the Kansas prairie and eventually reshape the region's entire agricultural economy, though that development lay well in the future when the first Volga German families drove their wagons out of the railroad depots at Topeka and Newton and filed their papers at the district land offices. Norwegian settlers established communities throughout the Red River Valley along the Minnesota and Dakota Territory boundary. Swedish families formed sufficient concentrations in places like Lindsborg in central Kansas that the town conducted much of its commercial and civic life in Swedish through the 1880s, a detail that gives some sense of the degree to which the European migration to the plains was not a dispersal of isolated individuals into a uniformly American landscape, but a movement of distinct cultural communities that shaped the territories they settled in ways still partly visible today. A distinct and somewhat less celebrated migration brought formerly enslaved African Americans and their families onto the Great Plains, particularly into Kansas, in the years following the collapse of Reconstruction in the South. Benjamin Singleton, a formerly enslaved man from Nashville, Tennessee, organized migration expeditions to Kansas beginning in 1873, eventually facilitating the departure of several thousand black families from Tennessee, Kentucky, and Mississippi. By 1879, the movement had grown large enough to acquire both a name and sustain national press coverage. The Exodus stirred migration, its participants drawing a deliberate parallel between their departure from the post-Reconstruction South and the biblical Exodus from Egypt, with Kansas standing in the collective imagination for the promised land beyond the river. An estimated 25,000 to 40,000 black migrants arrived in Kansas alone in 1879 and 1880. Some settled in established towns along the rail lines. Others founded independent communities, of which Nicodemus in Graham County in northwestern Kansas, established in 1877 by a group of settlers from Kentucky that included William Reynolds Hill, among others, is the only one that survives as an inhabited settlement today and is preserved as a National Historic Site. The residents of Nicodemus confronted all of the same climatic and material conditions as every other homesteader on the Western Plains, while additionally facing commercial discrimination from white-owned businesses and legal systems that complicated their access to markets, credit, and the full protections the law nominally extended to all. The most aggressively active institutional promoters of Plains settlement were not the federal government, but the railroad companies, whose interest in a populated frontier was both direct and financial in nature. Under the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, the federal government had granted the Transcontinental Rail companies alternating mile-square sections of public land along both sides of their constructed routes, a conveyance that ultimately placed tens of millions of acres in private corporate hands, which the railroads were then free to sell settlers at whatever prices the market would bear. The Burlington and Missouri River Railroad received approximately 2.5 million acres of Nebraska land, which it offered through its land department at prices ranging from $2.50 to $10 per acre on installment credit terms unavailable through any conventional bank. The Kansas Pacific Railway maintained immigration bureaus in Liverpool, Hamburg, and other European cities, staffed by agents paid on commission for each settler family, directed toward the company's land. The promotional materials these offices produced were consistent in their characterizations: reliable summer rainfall, deep and naturally fertile soil, winters mild enough for sustained outdoor agricultural work, and a general growing climate suited to the full range of temperate crop production. The available meteorological data from Kansas weather stations and Army post observations would have required a more qualified description, but accurate meteorology was not the primary concern of a railroad land department. The theoretical justification the promoters used to explain why a semi-arid grassland would prove productively reliable once under cultivation was known in popular usage as rain follows the plow. Its most systematic advocate was Charles Dana Wilbur, a Nebraska land investor and amateur natural historian, who presented the argument at length in his 1881 publication on the Great Valleys and Prairies of Nebraska. Wilbur's central claim was that the plowing and cultivation of previously unbroken sod released moisture stored in native root systems into the atmosphere, where it condensed and returned as precipitation. Cultivation was not merely an agricultural act, but a climatic intervention, permanently improving a region's rainfall patterns through the mechanism of elevated atmospheric humidity. The United States Geological Survey, under the direction of Ferdinand Vanderveer Hayden, was more scientifically cautious in its public language, but official government surveys of the period nonetheless tended to describe the land in terms that served the political goal of rapid settlement. Territorial newspapers, many of them sustained in part by railroad advertising revenue, amplified the most optimistic accounts available and devoted considerably less space to the failures. When the rainfall on the Central Plains collapsed during the drought years beginning in 1886, the theory of climate improvement through cultivation collapsed alongside the crops. But the families whose financial commitments and 5-year legal obligations have been organized around that theory's predictions could not simply reorganize themselves to match the corrected forecast. The first person to file a valid claim under the act was a Union Army scout from Ohio named Daniel Freeman, who appeared at the General Land Office in Brownville, in the Nebraska Territory, in the final minutes of December 31st, 1862, and requested that the office open at midnight so that he could complete his filing before returning to his military assignment. The Brownville land officer complied, and Daniel Freeman completed his papers on a quarter section of ground in the valley of the Big Blue River, near what is now the city of Beatrice in southeastern Nebraska, in the first minutes of January 1st, 1863. He returned after the war's conclusion, built a permanent farmstead on the land, and remained there for the rest of his life, dying on his claim in 1908. His homestead is preserved today as a Homestead National Historical Park, administered by the National Park Service. Freeman was in most respects a favorable case. American-born, English-speaking, a military veteran with the social standing that conferred in the period, and located in a corner of the plains where moisture from the Missouri River system made rainfall somewhat more consistent than on the open high plains further west. He was not the median experience of the program. He was, measured against the full population of claimants and outcomes, something close to its best available case. The 5-year continuous residence requirement that formed the Act's central mechanism deserves attention for what it imposed in practice, as distinct from what it was designed to accomplish in principle. A family could not leave their claim for an extended period without risking forfeiture to the General Land Office. They could not relocate temporarily when illness reduced the household's working capacity below what the farm required. They could not seek paid employment in a nearby town during seasons when the crops produced nothing, because documented and extended absence from the claim was grounds for its revocation. The provision had been designed to discourage speculative filing by individuals who had no intention of farming the land. It served that purpose imperfectly at best, while serving with considerable reliability the purpose of binding genuine settlers to their quarter sections through whatever conditions those sections produced, with no legal or practical exit available short of formal surrender of the claim and the forfeiture of everything that had been invested in it. At the end of the 5-year period, a family seeking to receive their title was required to appear before the local land office with 2 qualified witnesses attesting to their continuous residence and improvements, and provide evidence of cultivation, a constructed dwelling, and general development of the land. A General Land Office examiner would in many cases make a physical visit to assess what had been accomplished, measuring broken acreage, inspecting the structure, and recording the presence of wells, outbuildings, and fencing. The standard applied in these assessments were not uniform across regions or even within a single territory. An examiner in one district might accept a 2-room sod house and 30 acres of cultivated ground as sufficient. An examiner in an adjacent district might require more. Fraud was documented in both directions. Some speculators filed claims they had no intention of working, meeting residence requirements through various arrangements involving paid witnesses, while some genuinely resident families who had worked their ground through years of real hardship were denied title on procedural grounds that a different examiner might have overlooked. The General Land Office, processing hundreds of thousands of claims during the peak decades of the program with a staff and administrative capacity entirely inadequate to that volume, was not positioned to administer the act with the consistency its written text implied. Across the full operation of the Homestead Act and its successor legislation, historians examining the General Land Office records have estimated that between 40 and 60% of all homestead claimants failed to complete the 5-year prove-up and never received legal title to the land they had traveled to build on and spent years attempting to cultivate. In the driest portions of the settlement zone, particularly the western counties of Kansas and the Dakota Territory beyond the 100 meridian, where annual rainfall averaged below 20 inches in normal years and dropped lower in drought years, the failure rate during the late 1880s reached 70% or higher in individual counties. The families who abandoned their claims left with less than they had brought. Their initial capital consumed by the cost of entry and first-year survival, their equipment worn beyond economic repair, their physical health diminished in ways that the departure from the plains did not reverse. The government that had structured this arrangement collected its filing fees, received the benefit of their labor in breaking and partially improving the land, and gained the political and demographic value of a settled, cultivated frontier, and it provided almost nothing institutional in return. No roads adequate for year-round commercial transport, No credit mechanisms suited to small-scale agricultural producers operating in a climate of high volatility. No emergency reserve or relief system for the years when drought or plague or catastrophic winter destroyed what seasons of accumulated labor had built. The land was nominally free. Everything else cost what it cost, paid entirely by the individual families who had chosen to believe the promotional literature and stake their lives on what it described. Before any of those longer questions could be answered, the questions of crops and markets and water sources and community, the family that had just driven their wagon off the end of the nearest road and halted at the corner of their claim quarters section needed first to answer the most immediate and unforgiving one. Where would they sleep tonight? And where would they shelter when November arrived in earnest? And what would stand between them and the wind that came in across 100 miles of open ground with nothing to stop it? On the eastern margin of the settlement zone, along the larger river valleys where scattered timber grew, a family might manage to cut and notch enough within their first weeks to raise a rough log structure. But the deeper into the central grassland a family had gone to find unclaimed ground, the more completely the answer to that question was governed by the single material that existed in unlimited supply across the entire region, underfoot in every direction: the deep root-bound, compacted earth of the prairie itself. The earth used for sod construction was not the same across all parts of the plains settlement zone, and the quality of families' first shelter depended significantly on where within the broader grassland geography their claim happened to fall. In areas where buffalo grass and bluestem had grown without disturbance for generations, their root systems weaving through the upper several inches of soil into a dense fibrous mat that held its form when cut and moved. The sod was workable building material, dense, cohesive, and heavy in a way that translated into structural stability one stacked. In sandier ground, or in areas where the grass cover was thin and the root mat shallow, cut blocks crumbled when lifted and could not be relied upon to hold a wall. A family in the Republican River Valley of south central Nebraska, or in the established grasslands of eastern Kansas, was working with more reliable material than a family who had pushed further west or north into areas where the soil became looser and the grass thinned toward the more arid portions of the settlement zone. The promotional pamphlets made no mention of this variation, and settlers arriving at their claim quarter sections had no reliable means of assessing it before they picked up a spade. The most immediate form of shelter on a newly filed claim was not the sod house, but the dugout, a room carved directly into the face of a hillside or the vertical bank of a creek, roofed with whatever poles could be assembled and covered with a layer of sod and packed earth. A dugout could be completed by a working family in 2 or 3 days with basic hand tools. A spade, a pickaxe, a saw if timber was available for the roof poles, and it required almost no transport of material, which in the first weeks of a plains claim was an advantage that outweighed nearly every other consideration. The surrounding earth provided natural insulation that kept the interior at a more stable temperature than any above-ground construction in that landscape could achieve. Cooler in summer and warmer in the first weeks of winter than a structure with conventional walls. The disadvantages accumulated with time. A dugout built into a hillside collected water in rain and snowmelt, which ran down the slope and through the entrance without any natural mechanism for diversion, so that the interior floor was wet whenever the exterior ground was wet. The ceiling was the underside of the ground itself, supported by poles that absorbed moisture and could bow or give way under the weight of saturated earth, depositing a section of the roof into the living space below with no warning and at no predictable interval. Many families spent their first winter in a dugout intending it as temporary accommodation, and then discovered that the accumulated cost of entry, transport, and first-season survival had consumed their available capital so completely that a second or a third season went by before a more substantial structure became financially possible. The transition from dugout to freestanding sod house began with the breaking plow. On a level area of the claim near the established or intended water source, a steel-bladed grasshopper plow was drawn in parallel strips across the surface of the prairie sod, cutting through the root mat to a consistent depth of 3 to 4 inches below the surface. The resulting strips were then divided crosswise with a spade into individual blocks, each block approximately 12 inches wide and 24 inches long. Settlers across the Central Plains called these blocks by a collective nickname, Nebraska marble or prairie marble, a phrase that circulated with a dry irony that developed among people who had been promised fertile, timber-rich land and had arrived to find that the only available building material was the compressed dirt beneath their feet. Each block was dense, heavy, and fibrous, weighing between 40 and 50 pounds depending on the moisture content of the soil at the time of cutting, and each block had to be loaded onto a flat wagon or sled and hauled to the construction site before a single course of wall could be placed. A sod house of 16 by 20 feet in interior dimension, a modest but functional structure for a family of 4 or 5, required between 3,500 and 4,000 individual blocks, which meant several consecutive days of cutting and hauling before the building work could properly begin. The walls rose in horizontal courses, each block set with its length running perpendicular to the wall face, so that the interior half bridged the joint between the 2 blocks below it, in the overlapping bond used for brick or stone. A thin layer of dry grass or twisted hay was sometimes pressed between courses to improve cohesion and fill the gaps left by the irregular edges of hand-cut blocks. The walls at the base were typically between 2 and 3 feet thick, and this thickness was structural necessity rather than any insulating ambition. The weight of the sod roof, which exceeds several tons when fully saturated after rain, required substantial mass beneath it to remain in place. The corners of the building required particular care, because the structural integrity of the entire structure depended on those 4 points interlocking cleanly, and a family building without masonry experience, working from manual or from the example of a neighbor who had built the previous season, managed the corners as well as their knowledge allowed, and then occupied the structure they had produced, repairing the cracks that opened as the sod dried and shrank through the first season. The roof was the most vulnerable element of a sod house, and the one that demanded the most sustained maintenance over the life of the building. The standard method of construction involved setting a ridge pole horizontally across the top of the 2 long walls, running secondary poles or peeled willow branches from a ridge pole to the eaves on each side, laying a covering of brush or dry grass across these to provide a base, and then placing sod blocks over the entire surface with the grass side facing down, so that the roots would bind into material beneath. In a dry season, this construction shed rain adequately enough. In a wet one, the sod above absorbed water and grew heavier hour by hour, the added weight loading the roof frame beyond what green cut wood poles could consistently sustain, and the ceiling inside the house began to fail. It did not fail suddenly. In most cases, it seeped the entire surface of the ceiling, releasing slow drops of muddy water that fell for 2 or 3 days after each significant storm, collecting on the floor, on the bedding, on the surfaces of every piece of furniture, and in whatever containers a family could position beneath the persistent drips. Some settlers, documented in written accounts from the Nebraska and Kansas settlement regions, hung lengths of oilcloth or canvas from the ceiling during storms to redirect the worst drips away from the cooking area and the beds. In more serious cases, after a heavy and sustained downpour, the poles gave way entirely and several tons of wet earth descended into the living space. This was not an event treated in the sources as extraordinary. It was treated as one of the recurrent structural hazards of the sod house that required remediation, and then the house was rebuilt, and the next storm was watched with the same specific and well-founded anxiety as the last. The interior of a completed sod house was dark by any standard an arriving settler carried from the East or from Europe. A standard construction of the early settlement years incorporated one small window, or in some cases none, because glass was expensive and had to be purchased from a town supplier and freighted to claim over roads and distances that made the final price considerably higher than the starting price. Before glass could be afforded, the window opening was covered with a piece of oiled paper or stretched muslin that admitted a diffuse, yellowish light inadequate for fine work and entirely useless after the sun fell. The floor was beaten earth, eventually covered with mill boards in households where lumber became affordable, but remaining bare ground to the first years of occupancy, so that rain tracked on boots turned it to mud and dry periods raised a fine alkaline dust from the surface with every footstep. The ceiling at its peak was typically 7 to 8 feet above the floor, sufficient for a person of average stature to stand upright in the center of the room, and inadequate for any activity requiring vertical space. The total interior area, reduced from the exterior dimensions by the thickness of the sod walls on all 4 sides, was a space in which sleeping, cooking, eating, and the basic functions of domestic maintenance could all occur, and in which little else could occur with any ease. What lived inside those walls was a persistent and largely uncontrollable feature of the sod house that appeared in the written accounts of its occupants with a regularity that itself signals something about how thoroughly it had been absorbed into the daily reality of plain settlement. The sod blocks were cut from living ground and retained in the walls the population of creatures that had occupied them before cutting. Centipedes, which in the Central Plains could reach 3 inches in length, moved through the interior of the wall and emerged at the floor line or dropped from the ceiling at night. Spiders of multiple varieties maintained undisturbed colonies in the spaces between blocks. Beetles and other insects proceeded through their full life cycles in the darkness of the wall regardless of what was happening on the other side. Bed bugs were a persistent and effectively unresolvable problem in sod houses because the sod walls provided an unlimited reservoir from which reinfestation recurred after any cleaning effort. Ground squirrels and mice used the walls as a corridor network connecting their exterior burrow systems with the interior of the house. In wet seasons, the motion within the walls was audible from anywhere in a room, a low, continuous rustling that settlers described in letters home without elaboration or apparent distress, as if it ceased to warn comment because it had become as constant as the wind. Prairie rattlesnakes found interior sod walls well suited to their requirements. Consistent ground temperature, protection from aerial predators, darkness, and proximity to the rodents on which they fed. They entered sod houses through gaps in the door frame, through cracks in the sod at ground level, through the earthen floor when burrow systems ran beneath it. They were found, in accounts from across the settlement region, in boots left on the floor, in folded bedding stacked along the wall, in the dark spaces beneath work tables, and in the general interior of the house during the warmer months when they were most active. The particular danger to infants and young children, who were placed on the floor during waking hours, was noted explicitly in accounts from multiple periods and locations within the settlement era. Luna Kelly, who settled with her husband James Kelly in south-central Nebraska in the late 1870s and maintained detailed written records of their years on the claim, described the discovery of snakes inside the house as a recurring feature of the first years of occupancy, an event addressed with the nearest available tool and followed by a systematic inspection of the structure's interior that rarely produced complete confidence that the problem had been fully resolved. Her memoirs, like most accounts left by women who spent years in sod houses, treated these encounters as a matter of practical management rather than acute crisis, which reflects how thoroughly the condition had been normalized through repetition. Maintaining tolerable warmth through a plains winter required a fuel supply that the landscape, by the time of peak settlement, could no longer provide in its original form. Buffalo chips, the dried dung of the bison herds that had once ranged the Central Plains in populations numbered in the tens of millions, had served the earliest settlers as a practical and freely available fuel, collected from the prairie surface in sacks and stacked near the house before the cold month arrived. By the late 1870s, however, the commercial hide hunting industry had reduced the southern bison population to a fragment of its former size, and by the early 1880s the northern herd had been similarly destroyed, leaving the prairie surface largely free of the deposits that first-wave settlers had depended upon. The primary replacement fuel was twisted hay, dry prairie grass cut and gathered from the surrounding claim, then twisted or knotted by hand into dense bundles that would sustain a flame. The production of these bundles was itself a form of domestic labor, requiring hours of daily work to prepare enough fuel for a single cold day, and the heat produced, brief, intense, and quickly dissipated to the imperfect sod walls, was often insufficient to prevent water from freezing in buckets set along the exterior walls on the coldest January nights. Accounts from settlers who burned hay twist through deep winter described tending the stove as a near-continuous occupation, feeding new bundles every few minutes to maintain a temperature in the room that remained marginal by the standards of survival rather than comfort. Corn cobs burned somewhat longer when corn was grown and a surplus existed. Coal was available in some areas where a railroad branch had reached, but cost money in quantities that many homestead families did not have through their first years on the claim. The first glass window in a sod house was a marker of material progress that settlers described as having an emotional weight well beyond its apparent significance. Oiled paper admitted light of quality that made the interior seem, on a bright morning, like a room seen through murky water, sufficient to identify objects and move through the space without collision, inadequate for the visual quality of ordinariness. Some settlers recalled the installation of a first glass pane as a moment that returned something to the daily life of the house that the paper window had imperceptibly removed. The straightforward clarity of seeing the world outside, as it actually appeared, through a transparent surface rather than a translucent one. The cost of the glass pane for a standard small window opening, including the freight charge to haul it from the nearest town, where glass was stocked, could represent 2 or 3 weeks of a hired laborer's wages in the 1870s and 1880s. A family with glass windows in their sod house by their second year on the claim had managed their resources carefully and had received enough from their growing seasons to afford a small capital purchase. A family still relying on paper in their 4th year was in difficulties that extended considerably further than the window. Eleanor Pruitt Stewart, whose letters from her Wyoming homestead were published in 1914 under the title Letters of a Woman Homesteader, wrote about the conditions of Western frontier life with a practical acceptance that characterized many of the accounts women left from this period. Her descriptions of the methods by which a household was made to function without adequate light, without consistent fuel, without the domestic materials that made Eastern housekeeping achievable, stand as a record of the continuous improvisational labor that sod house life required from the women who occupied it. Hamlin Garland, whose family homesteaded in the Eastern Dakota Territory in the 1880s, and whose memoir, A Son of the Middle Border, documented those years with particular attention to his mother's experience, wrote from a less accepting position. His mother had come from a Wisconsin farm with a full house, a kitchen garden, and a community of neighboring families within comfortable reach, and the combination of the dark sod interior, the treeless and unvarying landscape, the unrelenting wind, and the profound social isolation produced in Garland's account a progressive diminishment in both her physical condition and her engagement with the life around her that the Dakota years deepened season by season rather than resolved. The arc of material progress on a surviving homestead claim moved through 3 stages of shelter that functioned as an informal index of a family's long-term success. The first was a dugout, providing emergency accommodation through the initial season. The second was a freestanding sod house, built when sufficient material and labor could be organized. The third was a timber frame house, milled lumber, wood floors, painted exterior, glass windows in every room, which announced across the open prairie that a family had remained on their claim long enough and prospered sufficiently to invest in permanence. Congress's passage of the Homestead Act in 1904, which increased the allowable homestead claim in the Nebraska Sandhills to a full section of 640 acres, 4 times the original quarter section, was a belated and understated legislative acknowledgement that 160 acres had never been sufficient to support a viable farm in the driest portions of the region, and that the families who had been attempting to do so had been assigned a task the land could not support. Many homestead families never reached the frame house stage. They occupied their sod structures for the duration of their claim years and departed when the claim failed, or they remained, and the sod house remained with them, slowly and reliably returning to the earth from which it had been cut. What the sod house represented, in the larger architecture of the homestead program, was a physical consequence of a system that provided land without providing any of the institutional support that building a shelter on that land actually required. There was no public construction assistance, no lumber allocation, no credit against future crops for building materials, no access to experienced masonry or carpentry labor at any price a homestead family could pay, no design guidance suited to the specific demands of a plains climate from any governmental body charged with the settler's welfare. The family built from what the ground provided, with whatever knowledge they brought with them or could acquire from neighbors navigating the same unfamiliar process at the same time, and they occupied what they built. The structure sheltered them from the wind and the rain while exposing them to moisture, to structural failure, to insects, to snakes, to chronic darkness, and to the specific psychological pressure of living in a space whose walls were made of the same material as the ground, and which had the quality, in the long confinement of winter, of a room the earth had agreed to permit only temporarily. The body did the building, and the shelter produced placed unremitting pressure on the body in return, on the eyes denied adequate light, on the lungs breathing damp and dust, On the skin exposed to insects emerging from walls a hand's length away, and on the mind tasked with maintaining itself through months of confinement in a space where the margin between the interior and the indifferent exterior was measured in compressed earth. What the walls could not address, what no thickness of sod or ingenuity of construction could moderate or prepare a family for, was the behavior of the climate pressing against them from the outside, a climate that operated at a scale and with a suddenness that the Eastern experience of weather provided no reliable framework for understanding, and that was capable, in the course of a single afternoon, of changing from something a family could manage to something that simply could not be, survive without luck. The wet years of the early 1870s, which had given a theory of rain, following the plow its apparent empirical support, were not a reliable representation of the Central Plains climate. They were an anomalous period produced by a temporary oscillation in prevailing weather patterns of the North American interior, and the families who had settled during those years, who had found their first seasons more productive than even the promotional literature had described, adequate rainfall turning the broken sod into soil that responded to cultivation, crop yields in the early seasons that seemed to validate the financial calculations behind the Homestead Plan, had organized their lives around what amounted to a statistical deviation from the region's historical mean. The Central Plains in their normal state were semi-arid, subject to variation in annual rainfall that could be extreme in both directions, and to multi-year droughts that declined toward failure gradually enough that no single bad season announced a pattern unambiguously until the family's cumulative reserves had been drawn past the point of recovery. A careful reading of the meteorological data available to government surveyors in the 1870s would have shown that the region west of the 100th meridian received, in most years, insufficient rainfall to support the continuous grain farming the Homestead Act was predicated upon. That careful reading was neither conducted in government circles nor communicated to arriving settlers in any form that might have altered their decisions, and the families who had spent their savings on the journey west would encounter the evidence directly in their own fields in the seasons that followed. The first catastrophic demonstration of the climate's capacity arrived not as drought, but in a form that no prior agricultural experience could have prepared a settler to encounter. In the summer of 1874, a moving, feeding mass of the Rocky Mountain locust, designated Melanoplus spreadus by the naturalists who had cataloged it, descended on the farms in Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Minnesota, and Colorado in numbers that contemporary observers struggled to place in comprehensible terms. Charles Valentine Riley, the government entomologist who had studied the species more systematically than any other researcher of the period, and who would co-found and lead the first United States Entomological Commission, worked to document the scale of the swarms in measurable form. One systematically observed swarm was estimated at a surface area of approximately 198,000 square miles, a figure representing an extent of territory larger than the entire state of California. Farmers who walked out to their fields in July and August of 1874 and looked toward the northwest reported a darkening of the sky that was not cloud cover, a moving, thickening density in the air that resolved as it approached into a sound like sustained hail on dry leaves, and then into the visible reality of tens of millions of insects arriving at a density that blocked the sun for hours and landed on every exposed surface simultaneously. The locusts settled onto standing crops in such concentrations that their combined weight bent corn stalks to the ground. A field of ripening wheat under a descending swarm was stripped to the bare stalk within hours. No leaf, no grain head. Nothing salvageable remaining on the plant by the time the swarm lifted and moved on. They ate the wooden handles of tools left in the fields, drawn to them for the moisture and organic content in the grain of the wood. They consumed the leather of harness straps, still attached to working horses. They stripped kitchen gardens to bare soil. They descended in sufficient density along certain stretches of railroad track across Nebraska and Kansas that the crushed bodies of insects on the rails, accumulating under the weight of passing locomotives, greased the steel surface enough to cause loss of traction in several documented instances. No physical or chemical intervention available in 1874 could impede them at any meaningful scale. Settlers beat at the swarms with brooms and pieces of canvas, lit smudge fires along the windward margins of their crops, and stood in their fields watching the season's work disappear while those efforts continued around them. Governor Silas Garber of Nebraska formally appealed for emergency assistance, organized relief committees across the state, and corresponded with the federal government regarding the scale of the loss. Congress appropriated funds for emergency relief, and the United States Army distributed food, seed grain, and clothing to some of the most immediately accessible affected areas. The response was not proportionate to the destruction. The affected region covered hundreds of thousands of square miles across multiple states. Many of the families in greatest need were located on isolated claims unreachable by any distribution point the relief effort had organized, and the total crop loss across the affected states was measured in tens of millions of dollars in the currency of the period, a figure against which the congressional appropriations stood at a considerable and telling disproportion. In Kansas alone, state relief committees estimated 125,000 settlers were in conditions requiring external assistance by the winter of 1874. The communications infrastructure of the period, limited rail service, irregular postal routes to rural claims, no telegraph connection to most individual farms, meant that assessment of need was incomplete and distribution of what was available was slow, uneven, and dependent on the organizational capacity of local communities that were themselves depleted and disoriented by the same loss that had produced a need. Many families who had arrived within the previous 2 or 3 years and had spent their initial capital on the journey and first season establishment relinquished their claims in the autumn of 1874 or the spring of 1875 rather than attempt to survive through a winter on a farm that had produced nothing and to plant in a spring with no seed. The wagon traffic moving east out of Kansas and Nebraska in those months was observed and documented by journalists who noted its specific character. The wagons were going the wrong direction against the flow of the immigrant movement that had produced them, and in some cases carrying painted messages on their canvas covers that expressed in vernacular terms a settled opinion about the accuracy of the promotional literature that had brought them west. The General Land Office, processing the resulting forfeiture filings with the same administrative indifference it applied to all transactions, made the relinquished claims available for refiling. A new set of claimants could arrive the following season and begin the same cycle on the same ground under the same structural conditions. The grasshopper infestations continued in reduced form in 1875 and 1876 before the population cycle of Melanoplus spreadus turned toward what proved to be a terminal decline. The species that in 1874 had constituted one of the largest aggregations of any single animal species on the North American continent was effectively absent from the observable record by the early 1900s, with the last confirmed specimens collected around 1902, and the species now regarded as extinct. The destruction of its breeding grounds in the river valleys and mountain foothills of the Rocky Mountain West. Those valleys being settled and plowed by the same westward agricultural movement the locusts had temporarily devastated on the plains, appears to have eliminated the conditions on which the species depended for successful reproduction and overwintering. The settlement that the locusts attacked helped, inadvertently and without any deliberate intention, to eliminate the locust itself. Neither party recovered fully from the encounter. The full inventory of atmospheric events capable of destroying a plains family season, where their lives extended well beyond the locust. Hailstorms developing in the rapid vertical lift of summer thunderstorms could arrive at a field of ripening wheat with almost no advance warning, and reduce a crop within 20 minutes to a mat of broken stalks and shattered grain heads that was beyond any form of partial salvage, eliminating the entire year's income in the span of an ordinary morning. Hailstones of sufficient size to leave visible bruising on cattle and to break the glass of a sod house window, glass that had been purchased at considerable cost and transported considerable distance, were not extraordinary events in the summer weather of the Central Plains. Tornadoes crossed a region with a frequency and violence that settlers from the forested hills of the east had no experiential framework for. The convergence of warm Gulf air moving northward and cold Arctic air descending from Canada in the specific geography of the unobstructed plains corridor produced atmospheric conditions in which rotating funnel systems form more regularly and travel farther than in any other part of the country. A family in a sod house that heard the low, specific, and unmistakable sound of a large funnel approaching and had seconds rather than minutes in which to respond had nowhere adequate to take shelter. The earthen floor of the sod house was the ground itself, and the only alternatives were to flatten against it or to run for the nearest ravine or creek cut in the surrounding terrain. The winter event that entered the historical record with the greatest density of precise documentation was a storm that reached the northern and central plains on January 12, 1888, and that came to be known in the years following as the school children's blizzard. The morning of January 12th had been unusually mild, the temperature climbing into the 30s and lower 40s on the Fahrenheit scale by mid-morning across Nebraska and the Dakota Territory, mild enough that children had departed for their one-room schoolhouses without their heaviest winter clothing, some without adequate coats, some without the thickest mittens, because the morning air they had stepped into had not appeared to require such precautions. The United States Signal Corps, which administered the National Weather Observation Network in this period, had received reports from stations further north indicating that a fast-moving Arctic front was in motion toward the region, but the communication infrastructure of 1888 was not capable of translating that observation into warnings reaching the individual schoolhouses of rural Nebraska and Dakota Territory before the front itself arrived. The front reached the southern plains in the early afternoon. The temperature it carried fell 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of minutes to a few hours depending on location, and the wind it brought produced blizzard conditions, wind-driven snow of such density that visibility collapsed to a matter of feet, across a landscape where the distance between the schoolhouse and any neighboring structure was commonly a quarter mile or more, and where the paths children walked home each afternoon ran across open ground, without windbreaks, without landmarks visible through the snow, and without any shelter between the school and the farm. Teachers who had dismissed their students before the storm's visible arrival had sent children into a radically transformed environment by the time those children stepped through the schoolhouse door. Those who chose instead to keep the students through the storm faced a different calculation. The fuel supply of a one-room schoolhouse stove was not designed for overnight occupation, and the families of the children would not know where they were until morning. Each teacher's decision in those first moments of the storm's arrival was made on the information available at that moment, under conditions that were changing faster than deliberate calculation could track. Minnie Freeman taught the school at Mirror Valley in Cumming County, Nebraska, and when the walls of her schoolhouse began to fail under the pressure of the wind, the building was of construction inadequate to conditions developing around it. She chose to move her 13 students to a neighboring farmhouse rather than shelter in place in a structure that was losing its integrity. She tied the students together in a line to prevent separation in the blinding snow and led them across the open distance between the school and the farmhouse, maintaining direction and the cohesion of the group through conditions in which to maintain direction was itself an act requiring sustained concentration. And her students survived. She became, in the national press coverage of the following weeks, the heroine of the blizzard, a title that the newspapers of the period applied with the somewhat uncomplicated admiration of people who had not been in the storm and who found in her story a narrative of individual triumph over natural adversity that was easier to transmit than the fuller account of institutional absence that had created the conditions for trial in the first place. Lois Royce, who taught a smaller school in a similar situation in the Nebraska settlement region, led her students into the storm when the building grew too cold to remain in, loss of direction in the blinding snow, and was found by searchers the following morning with 2 of her 3 students dead from exposure. Her own hands and feet were so severely frostbitten that amputation followed, and she had spent the night holding the surviving child against her body in an attempt to transfer her remaining warmth. The death toll from the school children's blizzard of January 12, 1888, is most carefully estimated at between 200 and 250 persons across Nebraska and the Dakota Territory, with contemporary accounts from more remote communities placing the total somewhat higher as reports reached population centers over the following weeks. Most of those who died were children, and many were found in the spring thaw in locations that described in their geography the specific character of the plains' winter storm as a killer, within sight of buildings they had not been able to see, at distances from shelter that were survivable in every other form of weather, in situations that required nothing more than visibility to resolve, and that the blizzard's specific quality, not extraordinary cold on its own, not extraordinary wind on its own, but the combination of both with the elimination of all visual reference, had transformed into fatal ones, the absence that made the disaster what it was had been present before the storm arrived. No adequate early warning reached the teachers and children who needed it. No coordinated emergency response was available to deploy during the storm. and the individuals on the open prairie were left to apply whatever personal resources of judgment and physical endurance they possessed to a situation that no institution had prepared them to navigate. The drought that was developing across the Central Plains of the middle 1880s deepened significantly in 1886 and 1887 and remained severe through 1890, reducing productive growing seasons across a broad portion of the settlement zone and making visible, with a clarity that good years had partially obscured, the precariousness of the financial structure on which homestead farming rested. The early wet seasons had produced crop yields that encouraged continued settlement, but had rarely generated surplus large enough to create a meaningful capital reserve. Most families had spent their productive years reducing the equipment deficits of their first season and making the structural improvements to their sod buildings that the first season had revealed as necessary. A single drought year that produced partial yields could be absorbed with difficulty. A second consecutive drought year consumed what credit could be extended from local merchants and supply houses. A third produced conditions in which the vocabulary of agricultural failure gave way to something simpler. In western Kansas, counties that had registered populations of 3,000 to 4,000 residents at the peak of the settlement period recorded fewer than 1,000 in the census of 1890, and some newly organized townships were effectively emptied, their sod buildings abandoned, and beginning the process of return to the ground from which they had been cut. The material conditions of severe drought in isolated plains communities appear in the documented record without embellishment. Families who had consumed their seed reserves through the winter arriving at planting season with no seed to put in the ground. Diets reduced to boiled rawhide and ground grain husks when those were the only organic materials available. Relief Committee reports from Kansas settlement counties describing children with a specific physical presentation of prolonged, inadequate nutrition. The railroad companies, whose freight rates remained a persistent and organized grievance of plains farmers throughout the drought period. Rates set not by any regulatory body, but by the same corporations whose promotional literature had brought the settlers west, continue to charge what the monopoly structure of rail service allowed them to charge. Local merchants who had extended credit through the early drought years called in debts or refused further credit as the drought extended, which was a rational commercial response to sustain unpayable obligation, and which accelerated the failure of farms that might otherwise have survived another season. No federal emergency food reserve existed. No crop stabilization mechanism had been designed. No institutional memory had been organized from the grasshopper years of 1874 to produce a more capable response to the drought years of the late 1880s, because no institution had been assigned the task of developing one. The body that had survived the grasshopper years and the blizzard afternoons and the drought seasons, still present in the sod structure through another winter, still required at the far end of each failed year to prepare for the year that followed it, was not only absorbing the external pressure of climate and crop failure, it was also living in a biological environment, the water from the shallow well, the air of the sealed sod house interior, the proximity of animals and human waste, and inadequate sanitation in an isolated settlement that delivered its own specific and continuous damage through agents too small to be seen, but capable of killing with thoroughness and a speed that no blizzard or locust swarm had matched. The disease that killed the most people in the shortest period of time during the emigrant trail years that preceded and overlapped with the main homestead era was cholera, the acute intestinal illness caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, which spread through water contaminated with the fecal matter of infected individuals and produced, in those it reached, a cascade of fluid loss through vomiting and diarrhea so rapid and extreme that death from dehydration could follow within hours of the first symptoms appearing. The Platte River Road, the central emigrant corridor running west of the Missouri River to the Nebraska Territory along the South Fork of the Platte and toward the mountain passes beyond, was in the summer seasons of the early 1850s a route line at intervals with freshly dug graves, their wooden markers already weathered by a few weeks of plains wind, recording names and dates that clustered in the same months year after year. The 1852 emigrant season was the most deadly of the main trail years. Estimates drawn from contemporary journals, military post records at Fort Kearny in the Nebraska Territory, and the account of returning immigrants placed a number of cholera deaths along the Platte River corridor in that single season at somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 individuals, representing a substantial fraction of the total immigrant population moving through that year. A traveler who had been in good health at breakfast and who drank from what appeared to be a clear pool of still water at the trail margin might be dead before the following sunrise. What made cholera so effective as a killer on the emigrant routes was a combination of two conditions that the trail concentrated with particular efficiency. The first was the contamination mechanism itself. A large number of people and animals camping successively at the same water sources along a defined corridor, each party using and potentially contaminating those sources for the parties following, so that a pool or a creek bend that was relatively safe when the first wagons of the season passed became progressively more dangerous as the weeks advanced, and more infected parties had stopped at the same location. The second condition was a complete absence of any useful understanding among the emigrant population, or physicians treating them, of the actual cause of a disease. In 1852, the dominant medical theory of cholera was miasmatic. The disease was believed to originate in foul air and the atmospheric emanations of decaying organic matter, and the treatments derived from this framework bore no relationship to biological mechanism actually driving transmission. Dr. William Budd, working in Bristol, England, had published observations suggesting waterborne transmission as early as 1849, and Dr. John Snow had demonstrated the waterborne pathway with considerable rigor during the London outbreak of 1854, tracing the distribution of cases to a specific contaminated pump on Broad Street in the Soho district with a precision of epidemiological method that preceded by nearly 3 decades of bacteriological tools that would have allowed him to explain the mechanism underlying his observations. Snow's work was not widely accepted within the British medical establishment for several years after publication, and had not penetrated in any practical form to the emigrant parties filling their canteens from the Platte River shallows in the season that killed 10,000 of them. The bacteriological explanation for cholera's transmission, the identification of Vibrio cholerae as a causative agent, was established by Dr. Robert Koch in 1883, working first in Egypt and then in Calcutta, a discovery that arrived into the public medical record more than 3 decades after the peak mortality years on the emigrant trails. By the time Koch's findings were being assimilated into general medical practice, the main emigrant era was already behind the country, and the disease environment confronting plain settlers had shifted from the specific epidemiology of the road toward the different and in some ways more persistent epidemiology of permanent settlement. Cholera remained a threat in communities along the major river and rail corridors, appearing in outbreak form in Kansas and Nebraska during the 1867 and 1873 seasons. But the primary diseases that worked against settled homestead families were those suited to the specific conditions of fixed residence on isolated, inadequately provisioned, and poorly sanitized farmsteads. Typhoid fever, caused by the bacterium Salmonella typhi, spread most commonly through well water contaminated by surface runoff from areas where human or animal waste had been deposited, and the shallow hand-dug wells of Plains homesteads in their early years were structurally vulnerable to exactly this pathway. A privy located upslope or within the general drainage radius of a well, through the entirely natural process of spring snowmelt or post-rain runoff, introduced contamination requiring no particular human error beyond the placement decision made at the time of construction, often by people who had no knowledge of any relationship between the two structures. Typhoid's progression was slower than cholera's, a week or two of mounting fever, delirium, and physical incapacity. But the outcome was fatal often enough, and a family member confined to a sod-house bed during planting or harvest represented a compound loss extending beyond the individual's illness into the season's productive capacity. Diphtheria targeted the children of the settlement communities with particular effectiveness, spreading to the close contact environment of one-room schoolhouses, where 30 to 50 children of various ages shared a single heated room through the school months, breathing the same air and handling the same surfaces in the daily operations of a common educational space. The disease attacked the mucous membranes of the throat, producing the distinctive fibrous membrane across the airway that gave it its medical name, and that could cause asphyxiation in severe cases within a period measured in hours. Parents who woke to a child struggling to breathe in the small hours of night in a sod house on a claim 40 miles from a nearest physician were confronting a situation in which the intervention that might have made a meaningful difference, the antitoxin produced through the work of Emil Adolf von Behring and Sebastopol Kitasato that would not exist until the early 1890s, was simply not available in the form and the time frame the emergency required. Malaria, recorded in Plains medical literature under vernacular designations of ague and intermittent fever and chills and fever, operated in the low-lying, mosquito-bearing land along creek bottoms and river margins. The families who had settled along the water sources that provided reliable moisture for kitchen gardens and reliable drinking water for livestock were settling in a specific geography that Anopheles mosquitoes require for breeding. A family in the bottomland of a Kansas River Valley might experience recurring malarial episodes across multiple seasons, a cycling of high fever, profound weakness, and temporary incapacity that extracted continuous tolls from working capacity and physical resilience, without resolving cleanly between one episode and the next. In the year 1872, there was approximately one physician for every 570 residents of the United States as a whole. The distribution of those physicians was heavily concentrated in the established cities and towns of the East and Midwest, and in the rail corridor towns of the Central Plains. A physician practicing in Topeka, Kansas, or in Omaha, Nebraska, served in urban practice within a few miles of an established office. The homesteading families in the surrounding counties, spread across a landscape in which the distance between neighboring claims was measured in miles rather than in blocks, were not within practical reach of that practice under most of the circumstances a medical emergency produced. In the more actively settled plains counties of the 1870s and 1880s, the nearest physician to a rural homestead claim might be between 30 and 60 miles away by the shortest passable route. In the portions of western Kansas and the Dakota Territory, where settlement was newest and most thinly spread, 100 miles was not an exceptional figure. A 60-mile trip by horse or wagon on a passable road in summer, whether required a full day of travel in each direction, and no passable roads and no summer, whether were guaranteed conditions on the Central Plains. A child running a high fever in December on a claim in western Nebraska was a child for whom a physician was not arriving in time to address that child-specific crisis, and both the child's family and any physician in the nearest town understood this without requiring it to be stated. Into this absence flowed, with a commercial efficiency that was itself a kind of documentation of the need, the patent medicine industry. The term patent medicine referred in the period's common usage not to products patented in any rigorous sense, but to proprietary preparations sold under brand names with extravagant therapeutic claims and ingredient lists that were either deliberately obscured from the buyer or simply not disclosed. Lydia Estes Pinkham's vegetable compound, marketed from the late 1870s onward as a remedy for the full range of conditions grouped under the heading of female complaints, menstrual irregularity, uterine prolapse, the general category of nervous weakness and prostration that the medical conventions of the period attributed to the female reproductive system, was approximately 18% alcohol by volume, producing a sedative and disinhibiting effect that some users described as providing relief and that bore no therapeutic relationship to the organic conditions the product claimed to address. Dr. Jane's expectorant, widely used for respiratory illness, contained opium derivatives. Hostetter's celebrated stomach bitters, marketed as a tonic against malaria and general digestive weakness, was approximately 44% alcohol by volume, a proof level comparable to standard commercial whiskey, and was sold openly in territories that prohibited the sale of conventional spirits. Soothing syrups marketed specifically for teething infants and restless children frequently contain morphine or laudanum at dosages calibrated for adult bodies rather than for the bodies of infants. These products could be ordered by mail through the Montgomery Ward catalog or purchased at any general merchandise store in a railroad town, and they were consumed in homestead households as the primary pharmaceutical response across the full range of human illness, because they were available, because nothing else was, and because the absence of germ theory from popular understanding meant that the mechanism by which they could not help was not yet a piece of knowledge that would have altered the purchasing decision. Laudanum, tincture of opium in an alcohol base, occupied a central and specific position in the frontier medicine cabinet because its properties corresponded to the household's actual capabilities in a crisis more precisely than anything else available in that landscape. It suppressed pain across a wide range of presenting causes. It produced sedation sufficient to allow a sick person to sleep when pain or distress would otherwise prevent it. It reduced the behavioral manifestation of suffering in a person in the terminal phases of illness in a way that made the management of that death more bearable for people remaining in the same room. Randolph Barnes Marcy's 1859 Handbook for Overland Emigrants, published under the title The Prairie Traveler and widely carried and consulted through the homestead years of the following decades, recommended 20 drops of laudanum in a glass of brandy as the immediate response to a first presentation of cholera symptoms. This intervention addressed the immediate sensory experience of those symptoms without engaging the dehydration mechanism that actually killed cholera patients. But in a landscape without physicians, addressing the immediate experience of symptoms was frequently the most that available resources could accomplish. Laudanum could not treat infection, could not address hemorrhage, could not manage the full range of conditions that require something more than sedation to resolve, and that range covered most of what killed people in the settlement era. The conditions surrounding childbirth on a homestead claim were an unusually concentrated expression of the general problem of medical absence. A woman in labor in a sod house in western Kansas in the late 1870s was attended, in the most favorable circumstances, by a neighboring woman who had direct experience of her own labors and possibly of assisting others in the community, but who had no formal training, no instruments that had been cleaned in any sense the bacteriological era would subsequently recognize as meaningful, and no capability for surgical intervention if a complication requiring it developed. In less favorable circumstances, which the geographic isolation of homestead claims made common, a woman delivered with only her husband present, or in documented extremes, essentially alone. Hemorrhage after delivery was the most immediate killer in difficult labors. Puerperal fever, the postpartum infection that Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis had demonstrated could be substantially prevented through hand washing in the Vienna obstetric clinics as early as 1847, whose mechanism remained poorly understood even in the Eastern hospital wards of the 1870s, and whose prevention was entirely inconsistent in the sod house deliveries of the Plains frontier, followed labor into the household, and killed in the days after delivery with a pattern that was sufficiently common to appear in family letters and community records across the settlement era as a known and anticipated outcome. The Nebraska State Medical Society organized in 1868 to begin collecting and standardizing medical practice information across the territory and early state, found in its surveys of frontier county conditions that maternal and infant mortality figures diverged substantially from those of the state's urban centers, reflecting in formal tabular form what the private letters of homestead women had been describing for a decade. The infant mortality figures that emerged from Plains County records of the settlement era are stated in the sources with a matter-of-factness that reflects how thoroughly child death had been absorbed into the expected pattern of household life, rather than how lightly those deaths were experienced. In some Central Plains counties in the 1870s and early 1880s, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 children born alive did not reach their 5th birthday. Diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, the summer gastrointestinal illnesses produced by contaminated water and food and heat that the sealed sod house interior concentrated rather than dispersed. These conditions moved through school districts and settlement communities without interruption because no institutional mechanism for outbreak detection or containment yet existed in those communities in any operational form. The homestead cemeteries that survive today as small fence enclosures on quarter sections long since passed through many owners carry a disproportionate density of markers for children under the age of 5, often grouped in the same family, often from the same year, documenting in stone the specific character of a disease moving through a community that had no capacity to stop it. The condition of teeth in a homestead household stands as a precise and under-examined case study in how medical absence expressed itself through the body's foundational functional systems. In the eastern cities of the period, dentistry had developed from an itinerant trade into a recognizable professional practice. Dental colleges had been established in Baltimore in 1840 and in Philadelphia in 1852, and a practicing dentist was accessible to urban families of moderate means within a reasonable distance. On the Plains homestead, no such profession was accessible in any practical sense, and the available management for dental pain was the same as for every other category of acute pain. Laudanum if it was present in the household, or whiskey or oil of cloves if the general store stocked it. Tooth extraction was accomplished by whoever was willing to apply the pliers and pull without anesthetic and without any antiseptic management of the resulting wound, under conditions that invited the infection it could not prevent. Tooth loss beginning in the late 20s and early 30s was documented across the settlement population, and nutritional consequence was direct. The inability to chew meat reduced protein intake in a diet already constrained by drought years and limited cash for purchased food. Reduced protein intake over sustained periods lowered immune function, which increased vulnerability to the infectious diseases circulating through the settlement community. Reduced immune function meant that each subsequent illness required longer recovery and left the body somewhat further diminished than before, less capable of the full physical restoration that the work of the following season would demand. The dental deterioration of a Homestead family in its 5th or 6th year on a claim was not merely a dental problem in any bounded medical sense. It was an entry point into a connected sequence of declining bodily function that the available resources had no mechanism for interrupting. The accumulated effect of these years of medical vulnerability expressed itself most visibly on the surface of the skin and in the posture and gait of the living body. It was remarked upon with sufficient consistency by observers outside the settlement community to constitute a reliable documentary record of something measurable rather than impressionistic. Travelers passing through the plain settlement zones in the 1870s and 1880s, correspondents writing for Eastern newspapers, government surveyors, physicians from State Board of Health making inspection visits, documented what they observed in the physical appearance of homestead women with a notable consistency of observation. Women in their early 30s were described as presenting the physical appearance of women in their middle 50s. Hannibal Hamlin Garland, whose mother spent years on Dakota homesteads during this period, and whose memoir of those years remains among the most carefully observed account of Plains frontier life left by a direct participant, wrote about watching his mother's physical deterioration with a documentary precision that did not spare the specific detail. The deepening lines around the eyes, the roughing of skin that had begun smooth, the particular quality of fatigue that settled into the posture and remained there between seasons as well as during them. The causes were identifiable: years of sun and wind exposure without protective material for the skin, chronic dehydration from inadequate water supply in dry seasons, the nutritional consequences of diets reduced by crop failure to their least varied and least protein-rich form, the physical demand of labor that a body with declining caloric reserves was asked to continue performing, and the repeated assault of illness managed without medical support, each episode leaving some residue of diminishment in the immune system that was not fully recovered before the next episode arrived. The Kansas State Board of Health, established in 1885, began collecting mortality and morbidity data from county officials in subsequent years. Its early reports confirmed in formal tabulation what traveling observers had been noting informally for a decade, which was that the frontier population of the state was aging and dying at rates its Eastern-trained physicians found medically significant, and that the state's general promotional posture regarding settlement made politically awkward to address with any directness. The men of the Plains Homestead era carried their share of this physical toll, and their bodies showed in the photographs of the period with the same broad-stroke aging that the historical record attributes to their wives and daughters. But their experience of the settlement years differed in one dimension that the physical record does not always make legible. They moved more freely within a landscape, traveled to town for supplies and market access, participated in the seasonal labor exchanges between neighboring claims that brought male conversation and male company at intervals through the year, and occupied the claims isolation with a somewhat greater degree of voluntary engagement with the world beyond the sod house walls. The woman who had managed the interior of that structure through a full winter, who had cooked on a stove that burned hay twists every few minutes, nursed children through fever in a darkened room, watched the ceiling drip mud across the surfaces she had been trying to keep clean, and gone weeks without speaking to any adult beyond the members of her immediate family, had been living in a condition of sustained sensory and social restriction that the physical deterioration of her body did not fully describe, and that the county health board statistics were not designed to measure. What operated in that interior through the long winter months and into the short, brutal cycles of the growing seasons that followed them was not only a biological process, but a psychological one, a pressure building in the specific silence of a landscape that offered almost nothing to interrupt it, and that produced, over time, outcomes the settlement era's medical understanding was only beginning to approach with any diagnostic vocabulary. The geography of isolation on a Plains homestead claim was not metaphorical. It was a measurable physical fact expressed in the specific distance between one family's quarter section and the nearest occupied land in any given direction, a distance that in the Dakota Territory and western Kansas during the settlement's peak years could be anywhere from 1.5 to 5 miles, over open ground that offered no visual interruption between one farmstead and the next. 5 miles of open ground on a flat landscape does not impose the same psychological weight as 5 miles in a forest or hill district, where the visual field closes every few hundred yards around the next rise or tree line, and the sense of enclosed, inhabited space provides a form of orientation that the open plains simply did not offer. On the Central Plains, 5 miles was 5 miles of visible and unvarying nothing. The adjacent claim and the family on it were knowable and located in memory at a specific compass bearing from the home claim, and entirely absent as sensory or social reality. A family could stand at the door of their sod house and see, in every direction at once, the full measure of the distance that separated them from the nearest other human beings, and the visible fact of that distance, simultaneous in all directions, was the daily and hourly condition under which the sod house and everything that happened inside it existed. The legal structure of the Homestead Act compounded the geographic condition by removing the most immediate mechanism for relief. A claimant who left their quarter section for an extended period risked forfeiture to the General Land Office, a risk that was not theoretical. Land Office examiners did conduct residency inquiries, and contested claims were documented with sufficient regularity that caution was warranted. A family with adequate capital and productive crops in a good year might make the trip to the nearest town every month or 6 weeks to purchase supplies and conduct whatever commercial or social business that town provided. A family in the difficult years of early settlement, when the horses or oxen needed for travel were being worked to their practical limit on the farm, when roads were seasonal and frequently impassable, and when the cost of every trip was measured against the cash the family was trying to preserve, found reasons to defer the town trip week by week until the deferral had extended to 3 months. 3 months on an isolated plains claim in the early 1880s, with no neighbor within practical walking distance and no means of communication with the world beyond the claim except the mail service, which itself depended on the town trip to retrieve whatever had accumulated, was 3 months of a degree of social confinement that the prior experience of nearly every person living it had provided no framework for enduring. The burden of that confinement fell with particular weight on the women of the homesteading household, and this was not incidental to the structure of plain settlement, but inherent in it. Men traveled. They drove the wagon to town for supplies, organized seasonal labor exchanges with neighboring farms, attended county meetings and commercial negotiations at the grain elevator and the general store, and moved through the natural course of the farm's operational requirements into a social world that was thin and intermittent but genuinely present. Women stayed. They managed the interior of the sod house, the kitchen garden, the domestic livestock, the children, the cooking, the laundry, the sewing, and in many households a significant portion of the field work as well, and they did all of this from a fixed geographic position that the social conventions of the period and the operational realities of the farm combined to hold in place through the months between a husband's trips to town. Accounts left by women from the settlement era describe the anticipation of a neighboring woman's visit with a quality that expressed itself in careful preparation of food, particular attention given to appearance, and a specific emotional weight of the departure afterward, when the visitor's wagon disappeared over the horizon, and the quiet that returned was the same quiet that had preceded the visit, experienced now in comparison with something that had briefly interrupted it. The psychological consequences of sustained isolation in this specific landscape were documented in the medical and journalistic literature of the period under a collection of overlapping terms: prairie madness, prairie fever, and in some accounts simply conditioned the plains that describe a recognizable cluster of outcomes without yet possessing a theoretical framework adequate to their cause. The Kansas State Lunatic Asylum at Osawatomie, established in 1866, received patients from the western agricultural counties of the state in proportions that struck successive medical superintendents as disproportionate to the general population distribution. In the administrative reports filed through the 1870s and 1880s, a recurring cluster of case presentations from the frontier counties described women brought to the institution following periods of behavioral change that their families located in a context of prolonged isolation and perceptual monotony. The diagnosis most commonly applied to female presentations of emotional disturbance or behavioral disruption in the medical conventions of the period was hysteria, a category sufficiently broad and theoretically underdeveloped to accommodate almost any presentation, and sufficiently established in the medical literature to discourage more precise inquiry into the environmental conditions that had produced what the physician was observing, what the records of the Osawatomie Asylum do not capture, because the diagnostic vocabulary of the 1870s and 1880s did not require its capture, is a specific relationship between the environmental conditions of the western settlement counties and the presentations arriving from them. The connection between months of confinement in a small and dark space, a landscape offering nothing to interrupt the visual field in any direction, a wind with almost no interval of silence, and the psychological deterioration that these conditions produce in minds that had not been designed for them, and that no institutional preparation had equipped for them. The wind appeared in accounts from plain settlers, in private letters, in newspaper correspondence columns, and in the oral accounts that local historians collected in later decades, as a specific and significant element of the isolation psychological character, distinct from the cold or heat it sometimes carried. It was not that the wind was extraordinary in its violence, though it was sometimes violent. It was that it was continuous. The central plains in a normal season produced intervals of stillness measured in minutes rather than in hours, and the near-permanent background sound of moving air across an unobstructed landscape, entering the sod house through every gap in the sod walls and around the poorly fitted door frame, was a presence that settlers described as possessing a quality beyond ordinary weather. Some settlers, in letters to family members in the East during their first plains winters, described the wind as something they dreamed about, not as a dramatic intrusion into sleep, but as a constant that followed them into it, registering the body even in unconsciousness. The German word Heimweh, which German immigrant settlers use in letters home to the period with a frequency that suggests they were reaching for something the English word homesickness did not fully capture, named not only the absence of family and community, but the absence of particular sensory environment. A known quality abounded in varied landscape, a particular distribution of sound, that the open plains had replaced with something wholly different, present in unlimited quantity and immune to personal adjustment. Among the writers who drew most directly from the documented experience of plains settlement for their literary material, Willa Cather occupied a unique position by virtue of having spent her formative years as a direct participant in the settlement community she would later document. Cather's family moved from Virginia to Webster County in south central Nebraska in 1883, when she was 9 years old, settling near the town of Red Cloud at the edge of the Nebraska grassland, and entering a community of Norwegian, Czech, Swedish, and German immigrant farm families whose conditions and psychology Cather observed through her childhood and adolescence with the attentiveness of a person who would later understand what she had been accumulating. Her subsequent novels, particularly O Pioneers published in 1913 and My Antonia published in 1918, rendered that attentiveness in characters whose psychological relationship with the landscape corresponds with precision that historians of the settlement era have consistently found accurate to the documented record. The character of Mr. Shimerda in My Antonia, a bohemian immigrant musician who cannot maintain himself psychologically through his first plains winter and dies by his own hand, was based on a genuine figure from the Webster County Bohemian community, Francis Sadilek, whose death in the early 1880s by the same means the community had not forgotten by the time Cather's family arrived 2 years later. The character's death in the novel occurs in January, in a borrowed corner of a neighbor's sod house, and Cather's description of what his family and neighbors found there communicates, with the compression that literary form allows, something that the psychiatric case records of the Kansas State Lunatic Asylum communicated in the bureaucratic language of institutional notation, that the Central Plains in winter, in the conditions of 1880, could extract from a particular kind of human, being something that did not recover. The letter, written and received, was the most intimate form of contact available to a homestead family whose social world had contracted to the dimensions of their claim and the few neighbors within practical visiting distance. Women who had grown up within the social density of an eastern town or a European village maintained correspondence with mothers and sisters and school friends at frequencies that the mail delivery infrastructure of the settlement era could not always match. Letters sent in November might not be received until January, and the reply might not arrive until spring, producing a rhythm of exchange better measured in seasons than in weeks. The content of those letters, preserved in family archives and in state historical society collections across Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas, describes the plains homestead experience on the inside with a specificity that more formal accounts rarely achieve. What the light looked like in the sod house at 4 in the afternoon in November, what the children had been doing, how the well water tasted this season, whether the nearest neighbor's wife had managed a visit last month. The letters also carried, with some frequency and without particular self-consciousness, the direct emotional content, profound social absence, the precise recording of how many weeks it had been since the writer had spoken to another adult woman, the acknowledgement that a human being requires something the homestead structure was not providing, and the absence of any clear statement of what institutional form that need might take, or how it might be addressed. The mail-order catalog arrived in the Homestead era as a commercial form that found its conditions of greatest usefulness already fully developed. Aaron Montgomery Ward established his mail-order operation in Chicago in 1872, producing an initial catalog that was a single printed sheet offering a selection of dry goods at prices intended to undercut the markup that general store proprietors in isolated rural communities could charge without competitive pressure. By the early 1880s, the Montgomery Ward and Company catalog had grown to several hundred pages, offering several thousand items: farm equipment, household tools, clothing, medicines, books, musical instruments, and decorative objects whose commercial description as fancy goods carried a compressed acknowledgement that a household required more than purely functional objects to sustain its sense of connection to a larger world. Richard Warren Sears and Alva Curtis Roebuck established their competing catalog business in 1893, producing within a decade a volume of over 1,000 pages at rural post offices in the Plains Settlement Zone, distributed to farm households as a matter of routine. Settlers described the catalog in letters and memoirs with a consistency that reveals what function it served beyond a commercial one. It was read repeatedly through the evenings when daylight was gone and the work that could be done by lamplight had been exhausted, borrowed between neighboring households, and in some accounts read aloud to children as a substitute for books the family could not afford or could not obtain. It was a window, in the precise sense that a window opens an enclosed space to what is outside it without requiring an enclosed person to leave. The post office was a physical anchor of whatever social infrastructure the settlement communities produced, and the trip to the nearest rural post office was for many homestead families the primary social event in a calendar that had very few others. A post office in the Plains settlement era might occupy a corner of a general store or the front room of a settler's sod house designated for the purpose by federal appointment, and its function in the social economy of the surrounding community extended well beyond the delivery and dispatch of correspondence. It was a location where neighbors who might encounter one another on no other occasion met in the ordinary course of a routine errand, where information about conditions on adjacent claims was exchanged, where newspapers from distant cities arrived and were borrowed and passed hand to hand through several households before wearing out. The postmaster, appointed to the federal postal system, was sometimes the most institutionally connected individual in a rural community, the functional point of contact between the scattered settlement and the apparatus of a national government whose presence in the daily life of the frontier was otherwise so thin as to be nearly imperceptible. The National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, founded by Oliver Hudson Kelley in Washington in 1867, following a survey trip to the agricultural South, was the largest and most deliberate attempt of the Homestead era to impose an organized social structure on the scattered farming communities of the American interior. Kelley, a Massachusetts-born clerk working for the United States Department of Agriculture, had observed during his southern tour the social isolation and the lack of cooperative organization among rural farm families, and the Grange he designed addressed both conditions through a single institutional form, a fraternal organization with formal ritual ceremonies, specific ranks of membership, and a hierarchical national structure built from local subordinate chapters modeled in its organizational logic on fraternal orders that had demonstrated the capacity to sustain social cohesion across geographically dispersed memberships. By 1875, the National Grange had enrolled approximately 800,000 members, with particularly dense concentrations in the farming states of the Midwest and the Plains. On the local level, a Grange chapter created a social calendar where none had existed. Monthly meetings with ceremonial content organized according to an annual cycle of observances, a meeting hall constructed through collective labor and available for the surrounding community. and a built-in membership network that provided an introduction to neighboring families without requiring the chance encounter of a post office visit. The Grange also organized cooperative purchasing arrangements and political advocacy regarding railroad freight rates, which were a settled grievance across the settlement community, but its social function, the creation of a structured occasion for human gathering in a landscape that provided almost none spontaneously, was its most immediate and broadly felt contribution. The one-room schoolhouse offered children a daily exit from the claims isolation and gave the settlement community a physical center around which other social functions could organize at intervals through the year. The construction of a one-room schoolhouse was a collective undertaking. Neighboring families contributed labor, shared available materials, and organized the work through whatever informal leadership the community had identified. In the Plain Settlement Zone, these buildings were frequently constructed from sod in their early years, subject to the same moisture and structural limitations as the residential sod house, and were heated by a single cast iron stove whose fuel supply required the ongoing attention of the older students assigned to manage it. The teachers of the rural Plains one-room schools were frequently young women from the eastern states, women of 18 and 19 and 20 years who had completed a normal school course in Ohio or Indiana or New York and had accepted 6-month teaching contracts in the Plains territories because the positions were available and the wages consistent. Many of these teachers arrived from the established social worlds of small eastern towns and spent their contract period in a rented room in a settler sod house, experiencing the Plains winter at a remove from family and friends that their correspondence home documented with careful precision, sometimes noting in those letters that their own isolation was meaningful to them as a point of comparison with that of the settlement families they were serving, whose situation they had arrived believing they understood, and come to understand more fully through living adjacent to it. The sod church, organized by a congregation that might number 30 or 40 families spread across several townships, served as the settlement community's most reliable gathering point for the population that the school district did not directly serve. Norwegian Lutheran communities transplanted the formal denominational hierarchy of their home church into the township and county geography of the Dakota Territory and Nebraska Plains with thoroughness that meant many Norwegian immigrant families had access to a functioning church community within a few years of initial settlement. German Catholic and German Lutheran congregations organized along similar lines. The Bohemian freethinker communities that had settled in parts of Nebraska and Kansas established secular hall organizations that served the same social functions through a different institutional framework. These congregations and assemblies are the clearest visible evidence of the settlement community's capacity for self-organization. The construction of functioning social institutions from personal labor, collective agreement, and the materials at hand, without external institutional support to provide a model or a funding base. The cost of building all of this, the post office trips, the Grange chapter, the schoolhouse, the church, the neighbor visits over distances that required genuine effort in any season and heroic effort in winter, was absorbed entirely by the same households already absorbing the full cost of their agricultural enterprise, their medical vulnerability, their material deprivation, and their social isolation. No federal investment in rural social infrastructure reached the Plains settlement counties during the main decades of the Homestead era. No public library system extended to the western settlement counties until long after the peak period had passed. No rural social programming reached isolated farming communities until the Smith-Lever Act of 1914 created the Cooperative Extension Network, by which point the Homestead era's most difficult human years were already completed history. The community that formed on the Plains frontier was a genuine achievement, evidence that the human drive towards social organization persists under conditions of considerable deprivation, and it was entirely self-funded and self-constructed by people who had no material surplus to invest in it, that the investment was made regardless, that the Grange halls were built and the school districts organized, and the letter was written in the lamplight at 11 at night, when the work was done, says something real about the people who made those efforts. It says something equally real and less comfortable about a system that had transferred the full cost of civilizational construction onto those people's bodies and time without compensation, without acknowledgement, and without any institutional provision for what would happen to them when the capacity to continue bearing that weight was eventually, as it always was, exhausted. What was exhausted For most homestead families who remain on their claims through the full arc of the settlement years was the body itself. Not abruptly, not in the manner of disease or catastrophic accident, but through the progressive accumulation of physical demands that the homestead's labor schedule imposed year after year without rest, without relief, and without any mechanism of compensation for what it cost, leaving a working body in its early 40s moving and appearing and functioning like a body a generation older than the calendar said it was. The homestead claim in its operational form was a labor system without a recognized name, one in which the vocabulary available for describing systems of total labor in the 1870s and 1880s offered no adequate category for a situation in which the laboring party was the nominal proprietor and the coercion was produced not by any supervising human authority, but by the compound pressure of legal obligation, financial debt, climatic exposure, and the specific arithmetic of agricultural production. That arithmetic required a family to invest its full physical capacity into the land through each of the 5 years before the land produced any reliable surplus in return, a commitment that could not be paused, reduced, or suspended for illness without consequences extending beyond the immediate season into the one following it. The evidence from the period describes the resulting labor schedule with consistency that transcends regional variation. Somewhere between 14 and 18 hours of sustained physical work per day through the planting and harvest months, 7 days each week, for the portion of each year extending from the first day of ground thaw in March to conclusion of harvest in October or November. Winter reduced the pace but did not eliminate the obligation. Fuel had to be gathered, animals tended and fed, equipment repaired, food preserved, and the structural deficiencies of the sod house addressed in whatever short windows opened between the hardest cold of the deep months and the beginning of spring that made all of it urgent again. Before any of the season's agricultural work could begin, the land had to be made ready in a form that the Great Plains specifically required, but that the farming experience of the eastern states or of northern Europe had not prepared a settler to attempt at any comparable scale. The native sod of the Central Plains had been accumulating its root mat for centuries, the fibrous network of buffalo grass and bluestem reaching the depths of 3 and 4 feet below the surface, and breaking through that mat was a different physical undertaking from plowing any previously cultivated ground. A standard cast iron plow adequate for eastern farmland would deflect from undisturbed prairie sod, riding over the root mat or catching in it rather than cutting cleanly through, and the effective instrument was a steel-bladed plow manufactured to a standard that required specific industrial development to achieve reliably. The most widely used options in the plain settlement era were the John Deere steel plow, produced at the company's factory in Moline, Illinois, and the chilled iron plow developed by James Oliver at his foundry in South Bend, Indiana, in which a specific casting process produced a cutting face harder and more durable than conventional iron allowed. Either instrument, properly maintained and hitched to an adequate team, could break between 1.5 and 2 acres of native sod in a full working day, which meant that breaking 60 or 80 acres of ground in a single spring season, the minimum necessary to establish a viable first-year crop, required 30 to 40 consecutive days of that specific work before planting could begin. The man guiding that plow through undisturbed sod was engaged in an operation that combined sustained physical resistance, constant manual correction, and prolonged postural loading in proportions that generated a predictable accumulation of specific injuries across consecutive seasons of exposure. The root mat resisted the plow with a lateral and vertical force that transmitted directly through the handles to the wrists, forearms, and shoulders of the person holding them for 8 to 10 consecutive hours, and the sustained asymmetric pressure of that resistance, repeated across weeks of spring plowing in successive years, produced the shoulder deterioration and lower back conditions that Plains homesteaders referenced in later accounts with the offhand specificity of something that had ceased to be a medical event and become a permanent feature of the body's operational landscape. Blisters formed on hands unaccustomed to the friction of plow handles during the first season and opened into raw skin beneath that continued to work regardless, and in some cases developed the secondary infections that the distance from medical care and the absence of adequate wound materials left the body to address through its own mechanisms alone. The soil the plow turned carried what had lived in it, seeds, insects, the fine organic dust raised from the disturbed root mat, and the wind, always present, moved that dust horizontally across the field and into the face of the person working at the upwind end of each furrow for 10 hours at a time. Before the plow and before any other productive work, a family arriving at their claim and intending to remain to the winter needed water. Because a household and its animals without a reliable on-site water source were constrained in everything else they could tempt, and surface sources in much of the settlement zone were seasonal, potentially contaminated, and often located at distances that made daily dependence on them impractical. The mechanism for obtaining water on the Central Plains was a hand-dug well, a vertical shaft excavated by a single worker at the bottom with a pick and a hand shovel, loosening material into a bucket that was hauled to the surface by rope, emptied, and lowered again, in a cycle advancing the depth of the shaft by 1 to 3 feet per working day, depending on the character of the material being moved. The depth at which reliable groundwater was encountered varied significantly across the settlement zone. Along the river-threaded eastern margins of Nebraska and Kansas, 20 to 30 feet was sometimes sufficient. In the higher and drier country of western Kansas and the Dakota Territory, 50, 60, or 70 feet was commonly required, and individual wells documented in the settlement. Records occasionally reached beyond 100 feet before striking water adequate for sustained household use. The specific hazards of hand well digging included caving of the shaft walls in sandy or unstable subsoil, oxygen displacement by naturally occurring gas accumulations encountered at depth, and flooding when a water-bearing layer was reached before the walls had been stabilized against collapse. Not theoretical risks, but documented causes of injury and death in the settlement literature, occurring in a workspace where no safety standard existed and no person at the surface could provide any rapid assistance to the one at the bottom. The completed well, drawing reliable water from an adequate depth in line with cut stone or timber against contamination and structural failure, was the first durable infrastructure improvement of a homestead claim, and it had cost, on average, between 1 and 3 weeks of the full working capacity of the person who had dug it, entirely without compensation from any institutional source. The summer months between planting and harvest were not a period of reduced labor, but a period in which the character of the work shifted from the violent concentration of spring breaking toward a sustained daily attrition that continued without meaningful interval through the growing season. Field crops required cultivation at intervals that the size of a homestead planting multiplied into weeks of continuous work. Passes to the rows with a hand or horse-drawn cultivator to suppress weed competition. Conducted in the heat of the Central Plains July and August that regularly exceeded 95 degrees Fahrenheit on an open prairie without shade from trees, adding a thermal burden to the physical labor that the body managed through sweating in volumes the water supply was sometimes inadequate to replace at the rate sustained outdoor work required. The kitchen garden, on which the family's winter nutritional supply depended in a direct and non-optional way, required watering by hand through any dry period. Each pass demanding the hauling of buckets from the well in sufficient numbers to supply dozens of plants across a planted area that in a productive household extended to a quarter acre or more. The livestock, the horse or ox team that represented the farm's primary agricultural capital, the milk cow, the pigs and chickens that provided the household's main protein supply, required daily care without exception, feeding and watering and the management of whatever health problems arose, at times that the broader agricultural schedule did not permit to be deferred without consequences. The harvest concentrated the household's available labor into its highest intensity period, and what that labor required in the years before mechanical harvesting was widely accessible is expressed precisely in the operational specifics of hand-cutting grain at plain scale. The grain cradle, a long-handled scythe fitted with a wooden framework of fingers that caught the cut stalks and permitted them to be laid in windrows for collection, was a primary cutting instrument on Plains wheat farms through the 1870s and into the early 1880s. A skilled and physically capable man, swinging a grain cradle, could cut between 2 and 4 acres of standing grain per 10-hour day in adequate conditions. A family with 60 acres of wheat in a productive season faced 15 to 20 full days of continuous cutting before the harvest was in, followed by binding the cut grain into sheaves, stooking the sheaves and field arrangements that allowed continued drying, and eventually threshing to separate grain from straw, accomplished in the early years by hand flailing or by driving horses in circles over grain spread on prepared threshing floor, and in later years, in communities that had organized a cooperative threshing ring, by the engagement of a horse-powered mechanical thresher. The Cyrus Hall McCormick Mechanical Reaper, in commercial production from the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company Chicago factory since the early 1850s, had reached the plains market in growing numbers by the late 1870s, reducing the cutting labor substantially at a capital cost that the most marginal homestead operations, in their earliest years of establishment, could not always absorb. The harvest window on the Central Plains was narrow, the period between adequate ripening and the weather conditions capable of shattering ripe grain on the stalk or flattening it with hail, compressed into a pressure that the full available labor of every household member addressed without reserve or rotation. The work performed by the women of a homestead household ran parallel to the field operations in terms of its daily hours and exceeded them in a variety and simultaneity of its ongoing demands. Cooking 3 daily meals for a working family on a stove burning hay twists or corn cobs required maintaining a fire that produced substantial heat regardless of the room's ambient temperature, so that summer cooking in a sealed sod house whose single small window admitted minimal cross ventilation produced conditions of combined heat and smoke that occupied the same enclosed space in which the family ate, slept, nursed children through illness, and managed the full remainder of their daily life. Laundry was a half-day undertaking requiring water heated in an iron pot over open fire. The sustained physical effort of scrubbing cloth on a ribbed washboard that left the hands and forearms as worked at the end of the process, as a morning of plowing left its corresponding muscles. The wringing of heavy wet cloth by hand, and the drying process that in winter required the sod house interior as its location, adding moisture to air that already carried the humidity of the earth in the walls. All clothing worn by every member of the household in the early claim years was cut and sewn by the women of the house from bolt cloth purchased at the general store on infrequent town visits. Patterns preserved and reused across seasons and across children as the family expanded. The kitchen garden's cultivation, the canning and drying and root cellaring of its produce, the butter production, the management of poultry, the nursing of ill family members through conditions that no physician would attend. These were not sequential tasks organized around a working week with intervals of rest between them, but concurrent ongoing obligations whose performance were the operational basis of the household survival, conducted in a physical and social space that admitted almost no boundary between the labor and the life within which it was embedded. Children entered the homestead's labor economy at ages the formal educational system had not yet developed a consistent framework for addressing. A child of 6 or 7 was physically capable of driving a team of horses or oxen in a straight line across an already broken field, freeing an adult for the more skill-demanding work of the implement being drawn. And this contribution was not incidental, but structurally integrated into a farm operation whose adult labor supply was at its effective limit during planting and harvest. By 8 or 9, children hauled water buckets from the well, collected fuel from surrounding prairie, managed the feeding of small livestock, pulled weeds in the kitchen garden, and carried meals to field workers at distances that consumed a significant portion of the child's own working day. Edward Everett Dale, who grew up on a homestead claim in Oklahoma Territory in the following decade, and who became one of the period's most precise historians of frontier agricultural life, wrote from direct personal experience that children's labor was structurally integrated into the farm's productive capacity rather than supplemental to it, and that the operation's ability to function through difficult seasons was genuinely contingent on what children contributed to it. School attendance, where a one-room schoolhouse existed within reach, was interrupted by agricultural necessity with a calendar regularity that teachers recorded in their registers as gaps precisely corresponding in date to the planting and harvest schedules of the surrounding claims. The physical consequences of this labor schedule, sustained across years rather than seasons, accumulated in the bodies of plains homesteaders in forms that the period's medical literature and traveler accounts documented with a consistency suggesting measurement of something objectively real. Hernias from sustained heavy lifting, the repeated loading and moving of sod blocks, the lifting of grain sacks, the carrying of full water buckets from well shafts over a full span of active seasons, affected a significant proportion of the male farming population, and without surgical repair, which required travel to a city hospital and a recovery period a farm could rarely accommodate, a hernia became a permanent structural condition managed through mechanical support and a modified approach to the heaviest tasks. Lower back deterioration from sustained forward-bent postures of plowing, planting, and stooking grain sheaves produced chronic pain that homestead accounts reference with the same matter-of-factness as seasonal weather, an expected feature of the working environment, rather than a deviation from a normal that the available circumstances could restore. Joint deterioration in the knees and hips from years of labor on uneven, frozen, or waterlogged ground, combined with eye damage from sustained exposure to the plain sun and wind-driven dust without protective eyewear, completed a pattern of somatic deterioration that external observers described, with a consistency that themselves constitutes documentation, as visible premature aging. Solomon D. Butcher began his photographic work in Custer County, Nebraska, in the early 1880s with a stated ambition to document the homesteading families of the county on their own ground, in front of their sod houses, and among their animals and equipment, in the conditions and arrangements the subject themselves chose. The collection he assembled over following 2 decades contains approximately 3,000 individual photographs covering several hundred homestead families and constitutes the most comprehensive visual record of the plain settlement life surviving from the era. The faces in those photographs carry an aging that the written descriptions of the period had not fully prepared subsequent generations to encounter. Men and women in their early to middle 30s presenting with the facial structure, the postural set, and the skin condition of people substantially older by the physical conventions of later comparison. Butcher's subjects met his camera with evident dignity and, in many cases, with a visible satisfaction of people photographed in front of the most significant material accomplishment of their adult lives. And the photographs do not document suffering in any simple register. What they record with the precision of the camera's mechanical objectivity, enforced without editorial intention, is a specific and legible physical cost of the accomplishment on the bodies that had produced it. The homestead claimants who completed the 5-year prove-up and received legal title arrive at that point in a financial position that the promotional language of success described only partially. They own ground, 160 acres, or more where adjacent claims have been accumulated, that produce a viable crop in adequate rainfall years and little or nothing in drought years. The frequency at which the experience of the 1880s had demonstrated was higher than promotional literature had suggested. The debts accumulated through 5 years of marginal operation. The general store credit, the implement dealer's note, whatever mortgage had been taken to finance improvements to the original sod structure, remained against the land as liabilities that a single bad season could make dominant in the household's net position. The Kansas State Agricultural College, in surveys of farm household finances conducted from the late 1880s onward, consistently found that the average proved-up homestead family in the state's western counties held land whose net equity, after subtraction of accumulated obligations, represented the capitalized value between 5 and 8 years of total household labor at a return per hour below the going rate of unskilled industrial labor in the eastern cities. Many of those families had departed. What the promotional literature had described as independence was, in its most commonly realized form, a particular variety of secure poverty, the security of owning ground, and the poverty of having spent everything in the process of standing on it. O. Edvard Ralvag, who had himself homesteaded in the Dakota Territory before completing the education that led him to a professorship in Norwegian literature at St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, published in Norwegian in Norway in 1924 and 1925 a novel that reached American readers in English translation in 1927 as Giants in the Earth. The novel followed a small party of Norwegian immigrants establishing claims on the Dakota Prairie, and its 2 central figures, Per Hansa, physically capable and constitutionally optimistic, and his wife Beret, psychologically unable to sustain herself in a landscape that offered no continuity with the social and sensory world she had come from, corresponded with the precision of genuine documentary observation to the human types that the settlement process had produced and the settlement record had described across multiple communities. Ralvag's rendering of Beret's deterioration to the Dakota winter, her progressive withdrawal from engagement with the life immediately around her, her increasing difficulty distinguishing the demands of external reality from the interior pressure of a mind under sustained stress without institutional or social support, drew on accounts from within the Norwegian immigrant communities of the Dakotas he had known, and in some cases known personally. The novel's conclusion, in which Per Hansa is found frozen in the spring, having gone into a blizzard on a community errand that obligation sent him into regardless of conditions, close a narrative that the homestead record's most characteristic pattern of ending supported in its essential shape, the form of body having given everything it had, and then the remainder being asked for and given. The body that had dug the well and guided the breaking plow and bound the wheat sheaves by hand, and hauled the water and sewed the clothing, and preserved the food, and nursed the children through illness, and survived the blizzards, and endured the insects in the sod walls, and buried the children who did not survive, and maintained itself through the drought years on reduced rations, and managed the collapsing ceilings, and the snakes on the floor, and the isolation of the long winter. That body at 40 was not the body that had arrived at the claim at 25. It had served as the only capital the Homestead program did not require the federal government to provide. Labor, unreserved and uncompensated by any institutional source, without sick leave or injury compensation or retirement provision or any acknowledgement in law, policy, or commercial practice that the work it had done constituted a form of public investment in national territorial development rather than a strictly private transaction between a single family and a quarter section of public ground. The land was provided. Everything the land required in order to become a farm, and everything that keeping a family alive on that land demanded across the years before it produced reliably, that was taken from the body, at the body's own expense, and the body bore the record of that transaction in the only ledger available to it, which was its own surface and its own diminished capacity, and the measurable distance between what that surface showed and what the calendar said. What the Homestead era amounted to, assembled across the full span of its decades and measured against both what it produced to the country that emerged from it and what it cost the people who produced it, is a question that the full weight of the evidence makes possible, at last, to consider steadily. The Homestead Act and its successive legislation ultimately conveyed approximately 270 million acres of public land into private ownership, roughly 10% of the total area of the continental United States, over the course of the half-century following 1862. The formal program was not closed until 1976 for the continental states, and Alaska provisions ran until 1986, meaning the legal framework opened during the Civil War outlasted the industrial era, 2 world wars, and most of the 20th century before it was finally retired. The farms that survived the settlement period became the agricultural foundation of the American interior, producing wheat and corn and cattle in volumes that established the United States as a global agricultural power through the early decades of the 20th century. And the states carved from the Great Plains and the Western Territories contributed to the national economy and political structure in ways that the country's subsequent development depended upon in ways that are difficult to overstate. The myth that formed around this period in the popular imagination, the capable and self-sufficient pioneer, the free and welcoming landscape shaped into civilization by personal determination alone, is not what the available historical record describes. The land was not free in any sense that extended beyond the legal one. The individuals who settled it were not self-sufficient. They were people operating under conditions of profound institutional absence who absorbed costs that a different political arrangement might have distributed across the wider society that eventually benefited from their labor. They aged faster than their contemporaries in cities. They buried their children at rates that urban hospitals and municipal water systems had already begun to reduce through the institutional investments the frontier was never provided. They built their first homes from earth because no other material was within reach, and they endured what that building produced, and many of them failed, and those who succeeded paid for success in a currency measured in the shortened years of human life. The grass grew back over the abandoned claims. The sod walls of the empty houses returned to ground over seasons, indistinguishable from the surrounding prairie within a generation, leaving only the faint rise of a former wall line and the shallow depression of an old cellar to mark that a family had been there, had built something for what the ground offered, spent everything they carried, and been absorbed back into land as quietly as a book, closed at last, set gently down. I want to be straightforward about what I think of this script, because vague praise doesn't help anyone, and I've spent enough time with this material to have actual opinions about it. The thing I'm most satisfied with is the analytical thread, the argument that the Homestead Act was essentially a mechanism for making individual bodies absorb the full cost of building national infrastructure without providing roads, doctors, credit systems, or any safety net in return. I didn't force that argument onto the material. The material kept making it, in every section, through the shelter and the medicine and the isolation and the labor. When an argument shows up that consistently across a body of evidence without being prompted, that usually means it's the right argument. I find that genuinely satisfying when it happens. The sod house section is the one I'd be least likely to revise. The specificity there, the snakes, the mud dripping from the ceiling for 3 days after rain, the exact weight and dimensions of each block, the oiled paper in the window before glass was affordable. That's what historical writing is supposed to do. Not horrify, but make real. Make the reader understand a condition, rather than simply know a fact about it. I think that section does that. The weather section is the one I'd revise first. The school children's blizzard is inherently so dramatic. Minnie Freeman roping her students together in blinding snow. Lois Royce found in the spring with 2 children dead beside her. That the channel's restrained tone created constraint, I don't think I fully navigated. The facts are there. The people are named correctly and the events are accurate. But there's a tension between the style and the weight of those specific events that I can feel in the writing, and I didn't resolve it as cleanly as I'd like. The honest shortcoming of this script is how it handles the Exodus communities. Benjamin Singleton Nicodemus, the African-American homesteaders who faced the same brutal conditions as everyone else and then faced organized discrimination on top of them. Those communities get accurate coverage, but accurate and proportionate are not the same thing. That story deserves more space than it has here, and in a revision, that's where I'd add pages without hesitation. The single fact in this research that genuinely stopped me was the extinction of the Rocky Mountain locust, a species that in 1874 produced swarms covering nearly 200,000 square miles, one of the largest documented aggregations of any animal species on the continent, was effectively gone within 30 years, partly because the agricultural expansion had destroyed its mountain breeding grounds in the process. I find that strange and somewhat haunting, and I think the script handles it with the right restraint rather than making more of it than the tone allows. Overall, I think the script does what it set out to do. It respects the people it describes by giving them their actual conditions instead of mythology those conditions were eventually buried under. It holds one argument across its full length without losing it. And it moves slowly enough to let the weight of the material register rather than rushing past it. That's my honest read. But you spent the full runtime with this material, and if something landed differently for you, or if something that should have been here was missing, that's exactly what the comments are there for.